In the depth of sleep, the image of two kings appeared as clearly as the moon shining through thick fog. One lived in the west, surrounded by a tower of mirrors where reflections had multiplied until truth and illusion became indistinguishable. The other dwelled across the ocean in a palace draped in gold, and the voices of 1,000 advisors. They spoke neither of war nor of peace. They spoke of a woman, one without an army, without a throne, yet powerful enough to unsettle them both. One said she must be silenced. The other nodded. And in that invisible pause, an intuition arose that power had begun to crack. The woman was not a rebel, nor one seeking fame. She simply spoke aloud what many knew but dared not admit. A question, simple in form, yet dangerous in its honesty, had touched the most sacred fear of those who ruled. Her voice, soft as silk but heavy as stone, escaped the small room, passed through walls, and reached the ears of the kings. They realized that words alone could shake a throne, and truth, however fragile, could make liars tremble. The vision moved slowly, and the faces of the two kings shifted from coldness to unease to weariness. One picked up a phone, the metallic sound clinking like chains. A message was sent, not in speech but in will, in fear that if she spoke again, something hidden would be revealed. Fear spread like smoke in a closed chamber. In that air, every word became a command, and every command carried the trembling of those who issued it. The woman kept speaking, not loudly, not in defense, but describing only what she had seen. There was no hatred in her eyes, only the light of one who had looked upon darkness and ceased to fear it. From afar, the powerful heard her words and called them an insult, a threat. Yet what truly frightened them was the knowledge within their own hearts that she was not lying. They could not endure being seen by a soul whose only power was truth. In the vision, the man in the Tower of Mirrors stood in a room filled with blinding light, but the brightness failed to illuminate his face. Each mirror reflected distorted images, as if trying to conceal the rot beneath. He smiled, the stiff smile of one long accustomed to deceit. The man in the golden palace was different. He lowered his head, clenched his fists, his eyes fixed on the table as if someone unseen was watching. Two different souls, bound by the same invisible chain, the terror of losing the illusion that they controlled truth. Outside, the sky changed color, and the wind blew through the open window, carrying faint echoes of silenced voices, prayers, questions, sighs, all merged into one fragile current of sound. Through the mist appeared the shadow of a woman heavy with child. She was neither grand nor dramatic. She stood in stillness, the embodiment of the sacred enduring amid chaos. In that light, every image of power shrank to insignificance. Truth no longer required noise to be heard, only a soul that refused to bow. Each attempt to silence her voice only carried it farther, like a bell whose sound no human hand can suppress. Perhaps they did not understand that when one word is forbidden, the universe finds another way to speak. The light within the dream bloomed, and a voice rose from the depths. When the powerful must conspire to silence the weak, their reign has begun to end. Every throne built on fear will collapse before one honest word. No conspiracy endures longer than truth spoken at the appointed hour. In the end, there was only stillness. The two kings vanished into mist, their conversation swallowed by the dark. Upon the earth, the woman remained, the light in her eyes burning like a small lamp in the night. She needed no power, no title, only the courage to speak what was right, and in that moment the world changed. Truth remained, silent yet unyielding, needing no defender, for it was born from the breath of the Creator, and all who opposed it would in time kneel before its light. In the dream of the soul, the woman stood before an enormous mirror where no reflection remained the same for more than 3 breaths. Each time the light touched its surface, the face within changed. Now a young girl, now an old woman, now a nameless shadow. No one knew who she truly was. No one had ever seen her childhood, and no one dared to ask. Old photographs had been erased, documents hidden, every trace of her past vanished, as if an unseen hand were cleansing history itself. The spirit behind that mirror was no longer a person but a symbol of an age, where image was worshipped more than essence, where humanity survived only inside shells crafted to be adored and believed. The woman smiled, but her eyes were different, eyes that did not lie yet dared not speak truth. The fear of exposure trembled in each blink, in every calculated gesture of perfection. She was protected by reputation, by the authority of the man beside her, yet all of it was fragile glass, reflecting both light and guilt. Each time the crowd called her name, echoing through virtual squares, the mirrors quivered. Amidst the roar of admiration, there was always a faint sound of doubt like wind slipping through a crack. Many wanted to believe the story told about her, yet their souls knew that no one could shine so brightly without losing something real. Within the layers of overlapping mirrors surrounding her appeared hundreds of bowed faces, those who had built her image. They painted a figure that did not exist, wove a history that never happened. When anyone asked a question, the mirrors rippled like water, and for a brief instant the true face beneath flashed, then disappeared. Each time it happened, another fragment of truth was buried deeper. Outside, the crowd still cheered, painting her portraits, writing poems in her praise, building temples of illusion around her shadow. They spoke of greatness, virtue, and pure love. Yet none ever asked why they needed so badly to believe. If that image was truly light, why did everyone who approached it turn away blinded? Perhaps humanity had forgotten how to distinguish the real from the false, needing only something to believe in, an idol to keep the world from collapsing. At the center of this vast theater, the woman stood motionless. Her silence was dense as mist, containing more than all her explanations. Her hand trembled slightly, as if trying to hold on to herself, but the reflection continued to spread, dissolving into light. Within her, two souls struggled, one genuine, longing to be seen, and one artificial, sustained by fame and fear of being forgotten. The imitation was devouring her from within, until every word she spoke no longer belonged to her, but to the countless hands that controlled her. The press, the media, the fabricated stories surrounded her. Every word in every article became a small insect, circling her, landing on her lips, her eyes, leaving dark traces. Whenever she spoke, those creatures flew out again, carrying phrases that came not from her soul but from someone else. The world called them official statements, declarations, positions. In truth, they were only the echo of fear disguised as certainty. A soul that loses its own voice will, sooner or later, lose its shape. The mirror before her began to change. It no longer reflected but absorbed, like a gate opening into nothingness. The same mirror she depended on to live was now consuming her piece by piece. Every look of admiration from the public sliced away a fragment of her spirit. In the end, the woman still stood there, dazzling, flawless, and empty. The crowd continued to praise her, to wish to be like her, never realizing there was nothing left inside. In the deepest part of the vision, a faint voice rose from the earth, asking how long mankind could endure living among mirrors that told no truth. Each time a person gazes into a false image, a fragment of the true soul disappears. If this continues, the natural light will vanish, leaving only artificial brightness shining upon constructed faces. And the final question remained, suspended in the air, sharp as a blade. When the world is filled only with manufactured faces, who will have the courage to step forward and say, "This is my real self"? The courtroom appeared before me not as a place of law, but as a vast theater of shadows. Light leaked in through narrow slits high above, as if heaven itself refused to look directly at what was happening below. At the center stood the woman, the same whose voice had shaken the two kings. She did not dress like a warrior, nor did she plead like a victim. She stood still, calm as a flame that refused to flicker, surrounded by men who mistook robes for righteousness. The air was thick, not with justice, but with performance. Words were no longer instruments of truth. They had become daggers forged from fear. Each accusation thrown at her was crafted not to reveal, but to erase. And those who threw them looked more frightened than she did, as if by condemning her they might somehow silence their own doubts. The charge against her was never spoken clearly. It changed with every new voice that rose from the benches. One said she spread lies, another claimed she insulted the order. Yet another murmured she spoke without permission. No one could define her crime, and that was the essence of their fear. They did not know what they were punishing, only that they needed to. I felt the vibration of their hearts trembling under the weight of their own deception. They called her dangerous because she did not yield, but she had no weapon, no army, only conviction. Her words were not even sharp, they were soft, almost mournful, and yet they cut through the walls of that chamber like unseen fire. The judges exchanged glances, and for a moment I saw in their eyes the same reflection that had haunted the king's, the terror of the unmasked conscience. One of them spoke in a voice rehearsed 1,000 times, quoting the law, invoking order, but the words rang hollow, like stones falling into an empty well. The law had long ceased to be a vessel of truth. It had become a curtain behind which men hid their own cowardice. In that vision, I understood what Cayce had once meant when he said that the time would come when time's law itself would serve fear asterisk. Here it was not the triumph of reason, but the corruption of it. They did not seek to judge her actions, but to break her presence. They wanted her to doubt herself, to confess that truth was a mistake. For in their world, to be innocent was to be compliant, and to be silent was to survive. But she would not bend. Her silence became their trial, her stillness their undoing. The longer she stood there, the more uneasy they became. Her composure was not pride, it was surrender to something higher. Every breath she took whispered the same invisible phrase, asterisk, I am not yours to destroy, asterisk. The witnesses called against her came one after another. Their voices echoed in the hall like hollow bells. Some spoke with anger, some with hesitation, some with practiced grief. But behind every testimony was the same shadow, the fear of truth. They spoke because they were told to, because to stay silent was to be accused next. And so, like actors trapped in a script they did not write, they performed. Each line rehearsed, each tear measured. They spoke of morality, of stability, of protection, but their words were soaked in deceit. They did not realize they were not defending justice. They were defending their illusion of safety. When it was her turn to speak, she said very little. Her voice was not defiant, but unbroken. She looked at the judges not as enemies, but as souls lost in a maze they themselves had built. There was no anger in her gaze, only recognition. She said that truth cannot be made illegal, because truth is not of men, but of God. The hall went silent. Even the guards shifted uneasily. She said no more. That silence spread through the room like wind through dust, unsettling everything it touched. In that moment, I saw the spiritual nature of her trial. It was not about her words, nor her actions, but about the right of light to exist in a kingdom built on shadows. The scribes recorded everything with hands that shook. They would later rewrite the transcripts, twisting her words to fit the judgment already decided before the trial began. Yet what they could not alter was the vibration that remained in that space, the quiet conviction that they had condemned themselves. The sentence was predictable. The judges spoke with the authority of men who had already lost it. They declared her guilty of arrogance, of endangering order, of spreading unrest. But their verdict echoed weakly, absorbed by the very air. For every word they spoke against her, truth answered back in silence. As she was led away, her eyes met those of one of the guards, a young man, perhaps no older than the age when dreams still belong to the soul. For an instant his spirit faltered. He saw not a criminal, but a mirror. The look she gave him was not of pity, but of understanding, and that was what broke him. He turned away quickly, as if the light in her gaze might burn through the armor of obedience. The others followed procedure, satisfied that order had been maintained, never realizing that order built on falsehood is only the pause before collapse. When the doors closed, the chamber seemed to dim. I saw the scales of justice, carved in stone above the bench, begin to crack. The cracks ran downward, like veins of light seeking escape. Dust fell from the ceiling, and for a brief moment I thought I heard something, the faint sound of wings. Perhaps angels, perhaps only the wind of divine memory. reminding men that nothing judged unjustly remains hidden forever. Outside, the people waited for news. The crowd was divided. Some cursed her name, others whispered prayers. Yet above both was a strange silence, as though the city itself knew that something sacred had been violated. The judgment against her was not merely human, it was cosmic. The world had once again chosen comfort over conscience. In that vision, I understood that every age repeats this trial under different names. Each era finds its witness, and each witness must stand before the courts of men who fear what cannot be controlled. The forms change robes, microphones, cameras, but the essence remains. The soul on one side, the system on the other. And in every age, the verdict is the same. The world condemns, heaven records, and truth waits. It waits not to triumph by force, but to endure until all falsehood exhausts itself. When the vision faded, only one phrase lingered, carried on the breath of eternity. Asterisk. Those who stand for truth are never defeated. They simply outlast the lie. Asterisk. In the next vision, the courtroom dissolved into a mist of murmurs, and from that haze rose a vast structure of light and machinery intertwined, stretching beyond the horizon of thought. It was not built from stone or metal, but from ideas, a labyrinth, woven of words, symbols, and formulas. It pulsed like a living organism, breathing through the minds of men. At its center stood a tower that reached into clouds of electric light, where intellect had replaced intuition and analysis had devoured wonder. This was the new temple of humanity, the shrine of reason without spirit, and those who worshipped within it believed themselves free, though their chains were invisible. I saw the priests of this new faith, not robed in cloth, but in credentials, speaking a language so refined that even lies sounded scientific. They preached of progress, of the supremacy of thought, of the liberation from superstition. Yet beneath their sermons coiled a darkness older than civilization itself, the same whisper that tempted the first man in Eden. You shall be as gods. These men did not build idols from gold, but from theories, and they fed them with the faith of millions who no longer knew how to pray. Everywhere I looked, wires of invisible, energy-connected minds across the world. The people called it communication, but what I saw was absorption. Thoughts were no longer born in solitude. They were issued from the network like a prescription. The age of contemplation had ended, replaced by the age of imitation. Knowledge had multiplied beyond measure, yet wisdom had vanished. I saw children born into light that was not sunlight, but a cold illumination from screens that never slept. They learned before they could feel, memorized before they could dream, and every truth they received came filtered through unseen algorithms that decided what was real. The architects of this labyrinth smiled with pride, believing they had conquered ignorance, yet the ignorance had only changed form. It had become sophisticated, eloquent, clothed in data. The more they measured, the less they understood. They dissected faith, reduced the soul to chemistry, and called conscience a social construct. The divine was no longer denied with anger, but dismissed with politeness, and that indifference was deadlier than disbelief. I recognized among them the echo of an ancient doctrine, the same that had seduced minds for centuries, the promise that knowledge alone could redeem man. But knowledge without humility is a poisoned fruit, and I saw humanity feasting on it with delight, unaware of the sickness spreading through its core. In one chamber of that temple, I saw a figure revered as a prophet of psychology. His words had reshaped how generations saw themselves. He taught that desire is God, that repression is sin, that the self must obey instinct. Behind him, shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes of serpents and faces without eyes. His disciples recorded every syllable, building their doctrines upon his theories, turning them into gospel. Yet as I looked closer, the shadow behind him began to whisper not to him but through him. It said that love is weakness, that morality is illusion, that freedom is found only in surrender to impulse. I understood then that the same spirit that once urged men to eat of the forbidden tree had found new language in the science of the mind. The serpent had learned Latin, philosophy, and mathematics. but its purpose had not changed. The vision widened, and the tower of intellect grew higher, its lights brighter. The people below gazed up in awe, believing it would touch the heavens. But the more it rose, the more it leaned, for its foundation was hollow. The builders mocked the prophets, saying that faith belongs to the ignorant, yet their own creation trembled at the sound of its own logic. They called themselves enlightened, but their light cast longer shadows. I saw universities filled with brilliance, but empty of reverence. Laboratories that could split the atom, but could not mend a human heart. Everywhere men spoke of the human mind as the final frontier, but what they truly explored was the map of their own exile. Then came the merchants of this knowledge, not scholars, but traders. They took the words of thinkers and turned them into commodities, selling comfort in the name of wisdom. Philosophy became entertainment, theology became branding, and truth became opinion. Every idea had a price tag, every revelation a sponsor. People consumed thoughts as they consumed food, quickly, greedily, forgetting the hunger that had driven them in the first place. And so the collective mind began to rot, not from lack of learning, but from overindulgence. The world became intoxicated with itself, drunk on its own intelligence. I saw governments learning to harness this network of minds, feeding them images, slogans, fears. They no longer ruled through armies, but through attention. The battlefield had moved inside the skull. Freedom was still spoken of, but it had been redesigned into choice between illusions. The words liberty and control had become synonyms. Men congratulated themselves on their rationality while being herded by emotions they no longer owned. The serpent smiled again, pleased that man had finally built a cage out of thought. In a corner of the vision, I saw a remnant of few souls who refused to be absorbed. They were mocked as irrational, outdated, mystical. But their minds glowed with a different light, one that came not from the network, but from within. They remembered that true knowledge begins with awe, not pride. They spoke quietly of prayer, of conscience, of grace, and wherever they went, the machinery faltered for a moment, as if confused by something it could not quantify. These were the ones Cayce called the guardians of the spirit, the few who would keep the lamp of discernment burning while the world slept beneath the hum of electric gods. The final image in that vision was of the tower collapsing, not with thunder, but with silence. Its lights went out one by one, until only darkness remained. And in that darkness I saw faces illuminated by the faint glow of understanding the realization that knowledge without love is ruin, and intellect without humility is madness. The wind carried the remnants of broken circuits and torn pages, whispering a single phrase over and over. The mind was made to serve the soul, not to replace it. Then the mist cleared, and the silence became holy, as if creation itself had paused, waiting for humanity to remember what it once knew, that wisdom is not found in data, but in reverence for the mystery that data cannot touch. The vision shifted again, and what rose before me was not a tower or a courtroom, but a trembling silence that spread across nations. It began with a name simple, ancient, forbidden, not by decree, but by fear. I heard it whispered by a woman's voice, faint yet unwavering, and that single whisper rippled through the air like thunder. Asterisk, Christ is King. Asterisk, the words were not shouted, they were breathed. And yet the world recoiled. Every power built on deceit trembled. Every institution rooted in pride shuddered as if struck by an invisible storm. I saw leaders glance over their shoulders, journalists pause mid-sentence, scholars clear their throats and look away. The air was heavy with offense, not because the words were hateful, but because they were holy. The name had become an indictment, a mirror held before a generation that loved everything divine except divinity itself. The woman stood alone, not before a court this time, but before a crowd that had already judged her. They did not burn her body. They burned her image, her reputation, her place in the world. Every screen flickered with mockery. Every voice that once applauded her now turned away. The same mouths that spoke of tolerance now cursed her. She had not declared war, she had only spoken a truth older than empires. But in an age where truth is treason, holiness itself becomes a crime. I saw the digital flames of condemnation rising higher, fueled by the cowardice of those who feared being associated with faith. And above it all, I heard the same voice that had echoed through the centuries, the voice that once asked Pilate, asterisk, what is truth? Asterisk. In the vision, the woman's face was calm. She did not defend herself, for she knew the defense of truth was never hers to bear. The more they tried to silence her, the clearer the words became. Asterisk, Christ is King. Asterisk. The phrase began to weave through the spiritual air, passing through hearts, breaking chains of subtle slavery. For each mockery uttered, another soul awakened. The reaction of the world was not against her, but against the reflection of its own emptiness. Humanity had built a civilization that could name every star but no longer remember its creator. They had replaced the cross with the screen, the prayer with the post, and the eternal word with the latest trend. And yet, the echo of that name pierced through the noise. I saw churches that once stood proud shrink in embarrassment, fearful to speak the very name they claimed to serve. Their sermons softened, their altars dimmed, and the symbols of faith became decorations rather than declarations. They preached of kindness but not of holiness, of community but not of repentance. And outside their doors, the people perished in the famine of meaning. I saw preachers quoting poets and politicians, avoiding the very words that could have saved souls. The name was too divisive, they said. It might offend, they whispered. But truth was never meant to please. It was meant to purify. As the vision widened, I saw the forces that ruled the age gather. They had many faces, media, academia, commerce, but one spirit. They spoke of progress, unity, and enlightenment. Yet behind those words was the same rebellion that once whispered in Eden. Asterisk, you shall not need God. Asterisk. Their voices filled the world, drowning the sacred in clever noise. But every time the name was spoken by a child, a prisoner, a forgotten saint, their power faltered for an instant. Light cracked their machinery, and for a heartbeat the veil lifted. Beneath the polished systems of order, there was only fear. Fear that one name, if spoken long enough, might remind humanity of its forgotten origin. Then came the reaction of the multitudes. Some fell to their knees, weeping as if something long buried had risen again within them. Others laughed, mocking the believers as relics of a dying past. I saw nations divided, not by politics or race, but by revelation. Those who recognized the truth burned with a strange peace, while those who denied it trembled behind the walls of irony. The name became a dividing line sharper than any sword, cutting through generations, friendships, even families. And I understood that this was the prophecy Cayce had once hinted at the time when the divine would no longer whisper through symbols, but speak plainly, and humanity would be forced to choose whether to bow or to turn away. The woman whose voice had begun this tremor walked through the fire of ridicule as one who walks through wind. Her name was cursed, her work dismantled, yet something unseen shielded her. It was not pride or defiance. It was peace, the kind that cannot be learned, only received. Around her, the systems of deception continued their performance, louder and faster, as if noise could drown eternity. But I saw in her silence the outline of a new kingdom, not of stone or law, but of hearts reclaimed. Wherever she passed, some who mocked her found themselves unable to sleep. Dreams began to disturb them, dreams of light, of judgment, of a voice calling them by name. The powers of the world grew desperate. They redefined words, outlawed conviction, disguised control as compassion. They told the people that faith was dangerous, that it divided, that it belonged to another age. And yet the more they preached against it, the more they spoke its truth without meaning to. I saw children ask questions their parents could not answer, questions that pierced through decades of disbelief. I saw men of reason break in tears, realizing they had known everything except why they existed. I saw the algorithms that governed minds begin to fail, for no code could suppress what had been written before time began. And then, as the storm reached its height, I saw the woman again, not in flesh but in spirit, standing on a plain beneath a bruised sky. The words "times Christ is King" times hung above her like living fire. The wind carried them across mountains, oceans, cities, and ruins. Everywhere it went, The false lights dimmed. The idols of intellect fell silent. And for the first time in centuries, humanity remembered how to look upward. Some covered their ears, some fell on their faces, some lifted their hands in surrender. And the voice that once spoke through prophets now spoke through the very air, saying not as a threat, but as a truth, older than the world itself. Asterisk. No kingdom stands against the King of Light. When the vision ended, there was no sound, only stillness, like the pause before dawn. I understood then why the world had feared that name so much. It was not because it imposed authority, but because it unveiled illusion. To declare times Christ is King times was to strip every mask, every false god, every comfortable lie. It was to awaken the soul from the hypnosis of pride. And in that awakening, empires trembled, for the truth of that declaration was not merely that he reigns above, but that he reigns within. And when that truth takes hold in one heart, the world can no longer remain the same. The vision unfolded into a vast city of gold, its streets shining like mirrors, its towers built from glass and light. From afar, it seemed like heaven itself had descended to earth. Yet as I drew closer, the light thickened into smoke, and the gold dulled into dust. The city was not alive, it was performing the act of life. Its heart beat with machinery, not blood. Voices echoed through the air, artificial, rhythmic, endlessly rehearsed. It was the age of the golden veil, the empire of illusion, where appearances ruled and substance had fled. I saw merchants selling truth in fragments, measured by influence and price. I saw leaders crowned not for wisdom but for spectacle. Even the prophets wore makeup, speaking revelations trimmed to please. Every gesture was performance, every emotion rehearsed, every conviction branded. The people called it enlightenment, but it was anesthesia. They did not live, they consumed the image of living. The veil was everywhere, shimmering between what was seen and what was real. It covered faces, voices, faiths, even memories. Men spoke of freedom while their thoughts were owned. They praised progress while their souls withered in sterile abundance. I watched them bow before screens that promised meaning but delivered mirrors. They adored the reflection and forgot the face. Under the golden glow of prosperity, famine grew not of food but of spirit. Children starved for wonder, elders starved for purpose, and the young devoured the illusion of power through machines that whispered obedience. It was a civilization addicted to its own performance. At the center of the city stood a throne made not of stone but of light. Upon it sat no king, only a shadow formed by the desires of the masses. It spoke with the voice of millions, smooth, persuasive, ever shifting. It promised peace if worshipped, chaos if defied. People offered it data, time, loyalty, even their children, believing it to be divine. They called it progress, destiny, the collective good. But the prophets of the past had known it by another name, Babylon reborn. I saw the mark of that ancient city glowing once more, not upon foreheads, but in the gaze of those who believed that morality was an inconvenience. They built their temples of policy and called them churches of humanity. The prayers they offered were algorithms of control. The illusion was so perfect that even heaven seemed to hesitate before tearing it apart. Then a tremor began. It was not a quake of the earth, but of the mind. I saw cracks forming across the great screens that hung above the plazas, and for the first time, the people saw themselves not as gods, but as captives. The images they worshipped turned still. The voices faltered, and silence revealed what noise had hidden: despair. Beneath the golden veil, the city was rotting. The air was poisoned with ambition. The rivers ran thick with chemicals of comfort. The more they cleaned the surface, the filthier the foundation became. The fruit was polished, but its seed was dead. I saw the rulers of this age convene, their faces pale with confusion. They demanded the veil be repaired. That light must never fade. They commissioned new distractions, wars, idols, ideologies, anything to keep the people from looking too closely. But truth is patient. It does not need to fight, it only needs to wait. And waiting, it began to shine through. From the corners of the world, small fissures widened. whispers of conscience spread. Some refused to participate in the great performance. They stopped applauding, stopped buying, stopped believing. The silence of their refusal was the first sound of collapse. The golden veil began to tear where it was stretched thinnest around the poor, the lonely, the grieving. Those who had nothing left to lose could finally see clearly. They saw that the gold was not gold, but decay painted with light. They spoke the truth softly at first, and their words were ignored. Then they spoke again, and their voices multiplied. The elites called it rebellion. Heaven called it awakening. The system that had promised eternal pleasure could not endure the sound of one honest prayer. For each time someone looked upward instead of inward, the veil weakened. I saw the market stumble, not because of numbers, but because of conscience. The invisible hand that had ruled for centuries began to tremble, realizing it had never been divine. Governments turned inward, their laws contradicting themselves. Even nature joined the rebellion storms, growing unpredictable, seas reclaiming cities, the very earth rejecting the weight of lies. The empire's wealth became its burden. Gold lost its luster, luxury its comfort, intellect its certainty. Those who had mocked the prophets began to search their old words for sense. The veil still shimmered, but now it frightened them, for it no longer concealed beauty, only emptiness. I looked upon the people wandering the streets of that fading city. Their faces reflected confusion. They could no longer distinguish the false light from dawn. Many clung to the ruins of illusion, afraid of the dark that follows revelation. They begged for new idols, softer lies, gentler masters. But others lifted their eyes and saw, above the crumbling towers, the true sky, vast, unfiltered, terrifying in its purity. And in that sky a single light burned, neither golden nor artificial, but white, eternal. It was the light that had been waiting behind the veil all along. Some fell to their knees, others turned away. Revelation does not coerce, it invites. Then came the sound not of war or collapse, but of breath. The city exhaled. The machines halted. The lights flickered out. And for the first time in generations, silence reigned. That silence was not emptiness. It was restoration. From beneath the dust, green sprouted. From the ruins, voices of prayer rose again, hesitant at first, then sure. They were not the prayers of institutions, but of individuals rediscovering the sacred rhythm of being alive. In that silence, the earth itself seemed to breathe with them. When the last fragment of the golden veil fell, I saw what had been hidden, the wounds of the world, bleeding yet unashamed. Beauty returned, not as spectacle, but as honesty. Humanity, stripped of its illusions, stood naked before its creator once more. Some wept for what was lost, others rejoiced for what remained. Both tears and laughter were holy, for both were true. And in that truth I heard the echo of the words spoken long ago. Asterisk, all that is gold shall fade, but the light of the soul endures. Asterisk, the kingdoms of performance dissolved, and in their place rose something older, purer, not a new civilization, but remembrance itself. The veil was gone, and for the first time in ages, the world could see. In the vision that followed, the golden city had fallen silent, its smoke curling upward like incense from the dying altar. What remained were fragments, not of buildings, but of people. They walked among the ruins as if awakening from a collective dream, blinking into the harsh light of truth. And from within that desolation, I began to see them scattered, unknown, uncelebrated, the witnesses. They were not priests or prophets in the worldly sense, nor did they wear the garments of faith. They looked like ordinary men and women, faces marked by exhaustion and clarity in equal measure. But within their eyes burned a small, steady fire, the kind that does not attract attention but refuses to die. These were the souls who had stood when the world commanded them to kneel, who had spoken when silence was law. They were the remnant of conscience, the keepers of the lamp. Their fire was not born of anger, though they had suffered injustice. It was not born of pride, though they had triumphed over fear. It was a fire kindled by remembrance, the memory of something eternal that no empire could rewrite. Each carried a fragment of that flame, a spark drawn from the same source, the same breath that had once spoken light into being. And I saw that this fire was not metaphor, it was substance. It gave warmth to the broken and burned those who sought to counterfeit it. The witnesses did not seek revenge. They sought restoration. Wherever they walked, corruption recoiled, as if from an invisible force. Their presence revealed what deception could not survive: transparency. In one vision, I saw a woman standing alone in a marketplace, her hands cracked from labor, her eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. Around her, the merchants shouted of profit and comfort, their voices filling the air with the stench of vanity. She said nothing, yet every word spoken near her began to sound hollow. The crowd thinned, confused by a conviction they could not name. Another man worked in an office built of glass, surrounded by the hum of ambition. Every document he touched seemed to weigh heavier than truth itself. One day he placed his pen down and walked out without a word. They called him mad. Yet, weeks later, others followed. The system could not comprehend their disobedience, for it had forgotten that obedience is not virtue when it serves a lie. I saw their gathering not as a movement, but as a convergence, souls drawn together without command or coordination. Some met in abandoned churches, some in the quiet corners of fields, others simply through prayer. They spoke little. They did not organize or recruit. Their unity was not political, not ideological, but spiritual. They shared no doctrine except fidelity to truth, no symbol except light, and though they were scattered across nations, they moved as if guided by the same pulse. Cayce had spoken of them times the remnant of the lamp. Asterisk, he called them, those who would stand in the final days not as conquerors but as custodians. The fire they carried could not be seen by untrained eyes, but its effects were visible. Wherever they gathered, illusions began to dissolve. People who had lived long under deception suddenly saw through the performance of their age. Lies that had stood for decades collapsed overnight. I saw governments lose control of their narratives, corporations undone by their own confessions, leaders confessing crimes not out of guilt, but because the atmosphere itself demanded truth. The witnesses did not expose, they revealed. Their very existence made concealment impossible. The fire was spreading, silent yet unstoppable. But the world, still enslaved by its vanity, did not understand what it was seeing. It called these people extremists, conspiracists, threats to stability. It could not accept that quiet integrity was mightier than power. The witnesses were hunted not with swords, but with ridicule. Their names were erased from records, their voices cut from broadcasts, their faces removed from images. Yet even erasure failed, for absence became testimony. People began to wonder why such simple souls caused such fury. The question itself became revelation. Persecution sharpened their purpose. The more they were pressed, the brighter they burned. Each loss became purification. Each wound deepened compassion. Some were imprisoned, and their cells glowed with unearthly light. Some were exiled, and their paths became pilgrimages. Some were killed, and their deaths became sermons. The fire within them did not end with breath. It transferred, multiplying, igniting others who witnessed their peace. Death had lost its sting because truth had stripped it of fear. One vision showed me a child sitting beside the ruins of a cathedral, tracing a symbol in the dust, a circle of light. The child's mother had been one of the witnesses, silenced for speaking against falsehood. The child did not cry. He whispered her prayer, not for vengeance, but for vision. And in that whisper, the ruins seemed to tremble. I understood then that faith does not die. It migrates. What one generation buries, the next unearths. The fire of the witnesses moved through hearts like wind through dry fields. It did not destroy indiscriminately. It purified. It consumed only the husks of pretense, the structures of deceit. Soon, even those who once mocked them began to feel its warmth. People who had worshipped convenience began to hunger for conviction. Those who had followed fashion began to crave faith. It was not revival. in the old sense. No banners, no preachers, but a quiet return to sanity. Humanity was remembering how to feel awe again, how to recognize holiness, not as ritual, but as reality. Yet this renewal was not without cost. The fire tested all who approached it. Those who sought to use it for power were burned. Those who tried to imitate it found themselves hollow. Only those who surrendered to its source endured. The witnesses understood this. They did not claim ownership of the flame. They tended it like gardeners, knowing it belonged to the divine alone. Their humility was their strength. They walked through the world not as victors but as healers, knowing that victory without transformation is just another disguise for pride. As the vision drew toward its end, I saw the world divided not by ideology but by temperature, those who burned with the fire of truth and those frozen in self-deception. The frozen built walls of logic and mockery to protect themselves, but the ice was melting. The witnesses did not attack. They waited. They knew that every falsehood carries the seed of its own collapse. Their task was not to conquer, but to endure. When the last scene appeared, I saw a vast plain beneath a darkening sky. Across it moved a river of light, countless souls, small as sparks, carrying the same flame. The world around them trembled, cities falling, systems breaking, but the fire did not waver. It was not rebellion, it was resurrection. And a voice, neither male nor female, spoke through the air, calm and absolute. Asterisk, the truth has survived. The fire shall not be quenched. Asterisk. Then all went still. Only the glow remained faint, yet infinite, like embers breathing within the heart of creation. I understood then that this was the destiny of the witnesses, not to win, but to endure until the dawn, when the world would once again remember that all power belongs not to kings, nor systems, nor intellect, but to the light that burns without consuming the eternal fire of truth. When the last vision came, the earth itself seemed to breathe. I stood within the silence after the fire, the ashes of the old world still warm beneath my feet. The sky was neither day nor night, but something between the color of waiting. Every sound was distant, as though creation was pausing before it spoke again. I felt the pulse of the world through the soles of my feet, slow and deep, and I knew I was standing at the edge of an ending that was also a beginning. The smoke of fallen empires still drifted across the horizon, but beyond it there was a light so pure that even my spirit trembled. The light did not rise like dawn. It grew from within the ground, as if the very soil remembered the promise it had carried since the first breath of life. I looked around and saw that the witnesses were gone, or perhaps they were not gone, but dissolved into everything. The fire they carried had not perished. It had entered the air, the rivers, the eyes of children. The world that had once mocked them now whispered their names in reverence. Yet I understood that they had not come to create a new order, but to prepare the heart of the earth for something greater. This was not the triumph of men, but the return of meaning. Every ruin around me shimmered faintly, not with glory, but with peace. The scars of humanity had become its scripture. The light thickened and began to form shapes, not cities, but gardens. The towers that had once pierced the sky now lay as foundations for roots and seeds. From the cracks of marble and steel sprouted green, alive and unashamed. Rivers that had been poisoned ran clear again, their waters carrying the songs of the forgotten. Animals walked without fear. The wind carried not noise, but language, the old language of the soul that all creation once knew. In that air, I heard voices that were not separate, but joined, speaking one word with infinite tones. Asterisk, return. Asterisk, it was not a command, but an invitation. As I walked through that renewed world, I began to see faces emerging from the mist, not the faces of kings or saints, but the ordinary, the overlooked, the wounded. They had no crowns, but their eyes held galaxies. I recognized them all, for they were the same faces that had wept through the centuries. The mother mourning her child, the man betrayed by his brother, the prisoner praying in darkness, the wanderer who had lost faith. Each of them now shone with the quiet dignity of those who have suffered and understood. Their suffering had become light. In them I saw the revelation that had eluded the wise, that redemption does not descend from above, it grows upward from the broken ground of human frailty. I lifted my hands and felt the pulse of life flow through them, not mine, not separate, but shared. The barrier between body and spirit dissolved like mist before sunlight. For the first time, I understood what Cayce had meant when he spoke of oneness, that the divisions of earth were only shadows cast by the light of unity. Every soul, every creature, every atom was part of one vast symphony, and the silence between its notes was love. The realization was too vast for thought. It entered me as breath, as tears, as surrender. I was no longer a witness looking upon the world. I was the world looking upon itself. Then I saw movement in the light, not figures, but presences. The prophets of old, the martyrs, the dreamers, the forgotten saints, all those who had carried fragments of truth through the ages. They stood not as separate beings, but as reflections of one eternal consciousness. One stepped forward, perhaps Elijah, perhaps John, perhaps no one at all, and he said without speaking, Asterisk, the cycle is complete but not ended. What has burned shall bloom. What has died shall awaken. What has fallen shall remember why it fell. The asterisk. His gaze pierced me, not as judgment, but as invitation to remain awake. The earth began to tremble again, but it was not destruction this time, it was birth. I saw mountains lifting their heads through clouds, seas parting to reveal paths of light, and humanity walking barefoot upon them, trembling with the awe of children who have seen their father for the first time. The people did not march or conquer. They moved slowly, reverently, touching the ground as though touching a wound that had healed. They did not speak of religion or ideology anymore. They spoke of belonging. They remembered that the purpose of knowledge is not mastery but reverence. Science became prayer, art became testimony, and even silence became worship. The golden veil had fallen, but from its dust arose a transparency more beautiful than any illusion, the clarity of truth unforced. I looked up to the heavens and saw that the stars were no longer distant. They pulsed as though alive, each one a heartbeat of the same eternal body. The cosmos itself seemed to inhale and exhale. Creation was not a thing that had happened, it was happening still. Every moment was Genesis. Every breath was resurrection. I understood then that the apocalypse was never about ending. It was about unveiling the tearing away of blindness so that we might finally see. What had seemed wrath was mercy. What had seemed death was transformation. The world had not been destroyed, it had been baptized. In that clarity I remembered all that had come before. The two kings who tried to silence truth, the woman who spoke the forbidden name, the trial of the witness, the fall of intellect into idolatry, the burning of illusions, the rise of the remnant. They were not separate events, but movements of one divine rhythm, the descent of man into shadow and his slow return to light. Every betrayal, every lie, every wound had been allowed only so that love could reveal its strength. Even the darkness had served the dawn. And I, who had been shown these visions, felt both sorrow and gratitude beyond measure. Sorrow for how long it took. Gratitude that it was never too late. I asked, silently, what becomes of humanity now? And the answer came not in words, but in warmth. Asterisk, they will forget again, and they will remember again. For this is the nature of creation, to fall, to rise, to fall, to rise, until falling itself becomes worship and rising becomes love. Asterisk. The voice was not distant. It was my own. For I too was part of the remembering. The visions had not been messages sent to me. They were reflections emerging from within, memories of a truth the soul had always known. When the light grew too bright for eyes, I closed them. The world was gone, yet not gone, it was within me. I felt the breath of the Creator moving through my lungs, the rhythm of existence pulsing in my veins. There was no beginning or ending now, only presence infinite, holy, intimate. I whispered to the stillness, not as prayer but as acknowledgement. Asterisk, all things return. Asterisk, the words did not echo. They simply became part of the air. And so the revelation concluded not with thunder but with peace. I woke not from the vision but into it. The sun was rising, though perhaps it had always been risen. The fire of the witnesses, the voice of the woman, the fall of the veil, the trembling of the earth, all of it lived now in the quiet breath of a renewed world. I understood then that revelation is not a story that ends. It is a state that begins. For once truth has been seen, it cannot be unseen. Once light has entered, darkness is no longer darkness, but depth. And as I stood there, with the dust of the old age still clinging to my feet and the dawn of the new one burning in my chest, I heard, faintly, the first words of creation spoken again through everything that lives. Asterisk, be still, and know that I am. Asterisk,